Welcome, friends, to Sci-Fi Travelers. In this episode, I'll tell you the story of Daniel, a human pilot, and Luna, an alien vampire. Sit back and enjoy the story. Happy viewing. My spaceship had been stolen, and when I found it, an alien vampire woman was sleeping inside. 3 weeks. 3 weeks, 4 days, and roughly 11 hours, though Daniel had stopped counting the hours somewhere around the second sleepless night in a docking bay that smelled of burnt coolant and someone else's poor life choices. That was how long it had been since a ship called the Marigold, his ship, the only thing in the galaxy that had never once left him, which was more than he could say for 2 ex-fiancées and a savings account, had been peeled off its mooring clamp at Veller Station and driven off into the dark like a stolen bicycle. People kept telling him to let it go. Insurance, they said, as though a man could take out insurance on a 40-year-old freighter held together by spot welds, prayer, and a single roll of adhesive tape he'd been rationing since the Halcyon run. The Marigold was not insurable. The Marigold was barely legal. She had a stutter in her portside thruster that Daniel had learned to correct by leaning, physically, to the left at certain moments, the way you'd coax an old dog up a staircase. No underwriter alive would touch her, and no thief in his right mind should have wanted her, which was exactly what gnawed at him. You don't steal a rust bucket like the Marigold. You steal something with resale value. Stealing the Marigold was less a crime than an insult with extra steps. And yet, he'd chased the insult across half the sector. He'd bribed a dock official with the last of his good whiskey and gotten a smudged registry ping. He'd bought a round for a hauler crew who claimed to have seen his ship burning atmosphere near the Threnody Belt, and then he'd bought a second round when it turned out they'd confused his ship with a completely different rust bucket, at which point Daniel decided the galaxy contained an unflattering number of ships that looked like his. He'd slept in transit lounges. He'd eaten things from vending machines that no responsible government would classify as food. He had, at one memorable low point, argued with a customs drone for 40 minutes about whether hope counted as contraband. The drone won, but he'd tracked it. Because Daniel, whatever his other deficits, and there were several catalogued in detail by both ex-fiancés, was very, very good at not letting go of things he loved past all reason. It was practically his only marketable skill, which was how he came to be crouched, at some unholy hour, in the underbelly of Kesk Reach, a station so far out on the lawless fringe that its own name sounded like a threat. Kesk Reach was where ships went to be renamed, restripped and reborn with somebody else's paperwork. It was a place with no working cameras, 3 competing definitions of law, and a bar for every kind of person who didn't want to be found. And there, in Bay 9, tucked into a pool of shadow between 2 larger vessels like the runt of a litter, was the Marigold. Daniel's heart did something complicated. Relief, fury, and a strange tenderness, all fighting for the same small space in his chest. She looked fine. That was the first outrage. Not stripped, not gutted. Her hull was even, he noticed with a spike of indignation, cleaner than he'd left her. Somebody had wiped down the grime around the airlock. Somebody had, apparently, stolen his ship and then tidied it, which felt less like theft and more like a passive-aggressive comment on his housekeeping. He crept closer, wrench in hand. It was a good wrench, heavy at the business end, and it had settled more disputes in Daniel's life than diplomacy ever had. He was not, he would be the first to admit, an intimidating man. He was of average height, possessed of a face people described as trustworthy, which is a polite way of saying forgettable, and his idea of a workout was carrying groceries up the ramp in one trip. But a man defending his home has a certain math on his side, and Daniel had done the math. Whoever was in there, thieves, chop crew, some grinning fence with a laser cutter, was about to have the very bad day they'd earned. The airlock was sealed. That gave him pause. Thieves didn't seal up behind themselves. They left doors flapping and consciences the same. He keyed in his override, the one nobody knew because he'd never told anybody, and the outer hatch sighed open with the same wheeze it always made. The little exhale of a ship recognizing its person. Traitor, he thought fondly. You let just anyone inside. Wrong. All wrong. The lights were dimmed to a low amber, warmer than he ever set them. The air was cool and still and clean, and it was quiet, not the empty quiet of an abandoned hull, but the hushed, held breath quiet of a room where someone is sleeping, and the whole space has arranged itself around them. Daniel edged down the corridor, wrench raised, every nerve strung tight, and looked into the cabin. There was a woman asleep in his berth. She lay curled beneath his blanket, his ugly gray blanket, the one with the scorch mark shaped like Australia, pale as station light, unnaturally still, her dark hair spilling across his pillow like ink across a page. She was, he registered in the useless way the mind seizes on trivia in a crisis, beautiful in a way that made the back of his neck prickle, and her ears, long and delicately pointed, swept back through that dark hair to fine tips, and between her slightly parted lips he could see, catching the amber light, the small, clean points of fangs. Daniel stood frozen in the doorway of his own ship, wrench forgotten in his hand, and had exactly enough time to think one coherent thought. That is not a thief. That is so much worse than a thief. And her eyes opened, crimson, and instantly, completely awake. Nobody had ever woken up like that in front of Daniel before. There was no fumbling, no bleary reorientation, no where am I grope for the edges of consciousness. One instant she was asleep, and the next she was simply present, crimson eyes locked on his, the whole of her attention arriving all at once like a door slammed open. Daniel had seen predators come awake on nature feeds, that trick cats have of going from dead to lethal without passing through any state in between, and his hindbrain, an ancient and reliable coward, recognized the resemblance and voted immediately to leave. Neither of them moved. She was watching the wrench. He was watching the fangs. It occurred to Daniel, with the crystalline clarity that fear sometimes lends a man right before he does something stupid, that in a fight between his wrench and whatever she was, the wrench and the man holding it would both be recycled into station atmosphere before he finished his backswing. He was standing in a doorway threatening a Sanguine of the night clans with a hand tool. It was, he thought, exactly the sort of dignified final act his life had been building toward. "Okay," Daniel said. His voice came out higher than he'd have liked. He cleared his throat and tried again, lower, which achieved a tone he could only describe as frog attempting authority. "Okay, so, this is my ship." The woman said nothing. She had risen up on one elbow, unhurried, the ugly gray blanket sliding to her waist, and she regarded him the way you'd regard a bug that had unexpectedly begun to lecture you on property law. "I want to make clear," Daniel went on, because his mouth, in a crisis, tended to keep operating long after his brain had filed for leave, "that I'm aware of how the wrench looks. The wrench is not the opening position of a negotiation. The wrench is just what I was holding. If I'd been eating, I'd be standing here menacing you with a spoon, and we'd both feel differently about the situation." He swallowed. I can see that there are fangs. I'm going to be honest with you, ma'am. I clocked the fangs immediately." Something flickered across her face. Not fear, not quite amusement either, but adjacent to it, the way a locked door is adjacent to a room. "You broke into your own ship," she said. Her voice was low, a little rough with sleep, and carried an accent he couldn't place, old and cold and precise. "Wrench first. That's the plan?" "I didn't break in, I overrode. It's mine. The override is mine. Everything here is mine, including the blanket That's my blanket, incidentally. That scorch mark is sentimental." He was aware he was babbling. He could hear himself doing it and was powerless to stop, the way you can watch a dropped mug fall without catching it. "I've spent 3 weeks looking for this ship. 3 weeks. I ate a sandwich out of a machine on velour that I'm fairly sure was structural. I argued with a drone, and I finally find her. And she's cleaner than I ever kept her, and there's you, asleep under my blanket, like a very frightening house guest who didn't RSVP. The not-quite amusement deepened by a degree. She sat up fully, and he flinched, and she noticed him flinch, and for a moment the crimson eyes went flat and tired in a way that had nothing to do with him at all. "If I wanted to kill you," she said quietly, "you would not have finished your speech about the wrench." "Yeah. No. I'd worked that out." Daniel lowered the wrench a cautious few inches. His arm was grateful. It's a bad wrench. For this, it's a great wrench for a coolant coupling. Then put it down. I'd love to. I'm concerned about what happens in the quiet second after I do. She let out a breath, not quite a laugh, but the ancestor of one, and something in the set of her shoulders came down. She lifted both hands, slow, palms open, the universal gesture, apparently even among the night clans, foresee no sudden murder. I'm not going to hurt you, she said. I didn't take your ship to hurt anyone. I took it to disappear. A pause. You were not supposed to find it. That was, in fact, the entire point of choosing it. Choosing it. Daniel felt a fresh flavor of outrage bloom underneath the fear. You picked the marigold. I needed something no one would look at twice. Something so unremarkable that searching it would occur to no one. Her mouth tilted. A nobody's freighter. No offense. That is layered with offense. That's a whole cake of offense. But he realized, setting the wrench down on the corridor grating as he said it. Some traitor part of him having decided that a woman who insulted his ship's resale value was probably not about to eat him. She watched him do it, and did not lunge, and the not lunging was, absurdly, the most reassuring thing that had happened to him in 3 weeks. You picked the one ship in the sector, Daniel said, straightening, whose owner is too broke and too stubborn to give up on it. Congratulations. Of every hiding place in the galaxy, you found the one with a homing pilot attached. I'm beginning to understand my error. She drew her knees up, wrapped his terrible blanket around herself, and looked at him with an exhaustion so total it briefly outweighed everything else in the room. The fangs, the fear, the wrongness of it all. She was hunted. He could see it now that the standoff had drained off, the way you can see the shape of a thing once the glare comes off the glass. She hadn't come here to steal. She'd come here to hide, and she'd chosen the least important ship in the sky because she was running from something that searched all the important ones. Who? Daniel heard himself ask, before wisdom could intervene. Are you hiding from? The crimson eyes came up to his, and for the first time she looked, not dangerous, but afraid. You don't want the answer to that, she said. Trust me. Take your wrench. Take your ship. Walk away, pilot, and be a nobody a little longer. It's the safest thing you own. The sensible thing would have been to take the advice. Daniel knew this the way he knew his portside thruster stuttered, a fact so established it had stopped being information and become part of the furniture of his life. A frightening woman he'd never met had just told him, in the kindest possible terms, to walk away from certain doom while it was still optional. Any reasonable man would have picked up his wrench, apologized for the intrusion, and let her keep the ship out of sheer self-preservation. Daniel made them both tea instead. He was not entirely sure why. Somewhere in the space between her telling him to leave and his feet declining to do so, a decision had been made without consulting him, the way his mouth made decisions during crises. Part of it was that the marigold was his, and he wasn't leaving her, hunted vampire or no. Part of it was 3 weeks of grief and exhaustion curdling into a stubbornness that had run clean out of self-preservation. And part of it, the part he'd examine later, and not much like, was that a woman running for her life had looked at his beat-up ship and called it safe, and no one had called anything of Daniel's safe in a very long time. So he went to the little galley nook, and he put the kettle on the induction ring that only worked if you set the mug down at a specific angle, and he found the 2 clean cups, and he made tea while an alien of the night clans watched him from his own berth with an expression of frank bewilderment. What are you doing? Luna said. Not really a question, more an accusation. Hospitality. It's a human thing. When we're too anxious to process a situation, we boil water at it. He set a cup on the fold-down table and slid it toward her, then retreated a diplomatic distance because he was brave now but not stupid. I don't actually know if you... Is tea a thing you can? Drink. I realize I'm making some assumptions about your, diet. I can drink tea. She looked at the cup as though it might be a trick. I don't require blood as often as the stories say, and never the way the stories say. That's, she paused, choosing words. A great deal of theater the clans encourage, because it's useful to be feared. The truth is more boring and less flattering. I need it rarely. I take it from willing donors or from the synth banks on the inner worlds, which taste, if you're curious, like licking a battery. Her mouth quirked. I have never in my life leapt out of a wardrobe at anyone. It would be exhausting and the dry cleaning is impossible. So the whole cape, castle, terrorizing the village thing is a marketing strategy, Luna said dryly, with excellent brand recognition and, I'll admit, a very high customer retention rate. Daniel surprised himself by laughing. It came out cracked and too loud in the quiet cabin, 3 weeks of tension escaping through the one available valve, and Luna watched it happen with the wary fascination of someone observing weather. Then, cautiously, she picked up the tea. She wrapped both pale hands around the cup, and something in her uncoiled a fraction at the warmth of it, and Daniel understood with a small pang that whatever she was running from, she'd been cold and alone with it for a long while. They talked. Not all at once, and not all of it, but over the next hours, while Daniel did the small, reflexive tasks of a man reunited with his ship, checking the fuel cells, cursing at the tape holding the nav console together, leaning left out of habit. It came out in pieces. She'd taken nothing from the ship but shelter. She'd cleaned it because she couldn't sleep, and idle hands unsettled her. The tidiness, it turned out, was a nervous habit and not a critique, which Daniel decided to believe for the sake of his pride. She'd been aboard 11 days. She'd chosen the Marigold off a Velour docking manifest precisely because it was registered to a single owner with no crew, no cargo contracts, and, she said with a delicacy that did not fully disguise the insult, no apparent prospects. And what I'm running from, she said finally, when the tea was long cold, and the amber lights had begun to feel less like a threat, and more like the inside of a shared secret, is not a what. It's a who. My clan has a... The nearest human word is elder, though it flatters him. His name is Kasser. She said the name the way you'd set down something heavy. He wants me back. Or more precisely, he wants what I know back, and I am unfortunately the container it's stored in. I saw something I wasn't meant to see. I understood something I wasn't meant to understand. And now I am the single loose thread in a very large and very expensive tapestry, and Kasser is the sort of man who resolves loose threads with fire. What did you see? If I tell you, she said, and there was real regret in it, you become a loose thread too. Right now you're a nobody who found his own ship. That's survivable. Knowing what I know is not. Daniel opened his mouth to argue. The babble was gathering. He could feel it. And that was the exact moment the cabin comm crackled and a bored official voice filled the ship. Marigold, this is Kesk Reach Dock Authority. We've got a registry flag and some questions about your recent movements. Stand by for a boarding inspection. The blood, what there was of it, went out of Luna's face. She was on her feet before the message finished, silent, coiled, all the sleepy warmth gone, and the predator he'd glimpsed in the first waking instant was suddenly the only thing in the room. That's not Dock Authority, she said quietly. Dock Authority on Kesk Reach doesn't inspect anything. Somebody's paid them to knock. Her crimson eyes fixed on him, and this time the fear in them was for both of them. Daniel, I need you to decide what you are in the next 10 seconds, because they're not here for a nobody's freighter anymore. 10 seconds is not, it turns out, very long to decide the shape of the rest of your life. Daniel spent the first 2 of them staring at the comm panel with his mouth open, the third realizing that his heart had relocated somewhere up near his tonsils, and the fourth having a small, vivid daydream in which he simply lay down on the floor and let events happen to him, which had the appeal of any plan that involves no further effort. Then he looked at Luna, at the way she'd gone still and cornered, ready to run or fight and expecting no help from anyone, because that was clearly how the last long stretch of her life had gone, and something in him made the decision his brain was still too busy to file paperwork on. Get in the co-pilot seat, he said, and if anything I do makes a noise, pretend it's supposed to. He was already moving, sliding into the pilot's berth she'd been sleeping in 11 days, hands finding the controls with the muscle memory of a man who'd flown this ship drunk, grieving, and once, memorably, upside down. The Marigold woke under his fingers with her usual sequence of complaints, the nav console flickering, the life support fan making the sound of a large insect clearing its throat, the whole console lighting in a pattern that no other human alive could have read as ready. "They've clamped the docking arm," Luna said, dropping into the co-pilot seat, scanning the readouts with alarming fluency. "You can't undock. There's a hard seal." "There's a hard seal," Daniel agreed. "And there's the Marigold." He flipped a cover off a switch that the manufacturer had, in a fit of optimism, labeled Emergency Decouple, and in smaller letters beneath, Void's Warranty. "My warranty expired during a previous administration." He hit it. There was a bang that traveled through the deck and up his spine, the wrenching shriek of a docking clamp being asked to do something it had opinions about, and then the sickening free-fall lurch of a ship suddenly and violently unmoored. Somewhere behind them, faintly, he heard the boarding party begin to shout. The airlock they'd been cutting into was now venting into a rapidly widening gap of vacuum, which Daniel felt was a fair consequence for lying about being dock authority. "Lean left," he said. "What?" "Port side thruster stutters. Lean left. Trust me." She leaned left. The Marigold fish-tailed out of Bay 9 like a shopping cart with a bad wheel, clipped the mooring pylon of the vessel beside them. Daniel apologized to it out loud, reflexively, and dropped into the gap between two hulls with about a meter to spare on either side, which Daniel navigated by the time-honored method of not looking too closely and hoping. Behind them, two sleek station skiffs were already peeling off their cradles, all clean lines and functional menace, ships that had never once had to lean left in their lives. "Those are cassers," Luna said tightly. "The dock crew were just paid help. Those are the real thing. Great. Wonderful. Love that for us." Daniel threw the Marigold into the tangle of struts and gantries that made up the underside of Kesk Reach, threading through a forest of industrial architecture at a speed that would have gotten him arrested anywhere with a functioning legal system. This was the one thing he was actually good at. Not fighting, not talking. This. He knew his ship's every flaw and had spent a decade turning each of them into a move nobody expecting a competent vessel would predict. The stutter that made her yaw. The sticky attitude jet that fired late and hard. He flew the Marigold the way you'd ride a horse that hated you but had, over years, agreed to a working relationship. A skiff came around a gantry ahead, cutting him off, and Daniel did something that made Luna grab the console. He killed thrust, let the ship drop on the station's spin, and reignited under the skiff's belly close enough to read its hull number, coming up on the far side while the pilot was still turning to where he should have been. "You're insane," Luna breathed. "I'm economical. I can't outgun them, so I have to out-embarrass them." A shot went wide off their flank, the ship shuddering. Okay. Less embarrassing than I'd hoped. They cleared the station's underside into open dark, and for one glorious second, there was nothing but stars and the burn toward jump distance. And then the second skiff came out of nowhere on an intercept and put a lance of energy straight across the Marigold's stern. The whole ship screamed. Alarms Daniel didn't even know still worked lit up in protest. The portside thruster, already a delicate soul, went from a stutter to a full sulk, and the fuel readout began doing arithmetic that ended in a number Daniel didn't like. "We're hit," he said unnecessarily. "We're hit. We're leaking, and the jump drive needs 90 seconds to spool, and we have maybe 40 before they line up again." Luna's hands were flying over the co-pilot console. "Then give me the 40, she said, "and I'll give you the reason they don't get their shot." She looked at him, crimson eyes fierce, and for the first time, alive with something other than exhaustion. A hard, reckless hope. "You said you out-embarrass people. Fly ugly, pilot. Fly as ugly as she'll go. I'll do the rest." And Daniel, leaking fuel into the dark with a vampire riding shotgun and a warlord's ships on his tail, grinned like a lunatic and gave the Marigold everything she had left. What Luna did with the 40 seconds, Daniel would spend some time afterward trying to understand and never entirely manage. She rerouted power he didn't know the Marigold had, dumping the failing portside thruster's feed into a burst of superheated coolant vapor that bloomed behind them like a squid's ink. And while the pursuing skiff's sensors chewed on that, she spoofed the Marigold's transponder to broadcast the identity of a station tug, so that for 3 critical seconds, Kasser's pilots were shooting at what their instruments insisted was harmless municipal infrastructure. It bought exactly the window they needed. The jump drive caught with a sound, like the ship swallowing wrong. The stars smeared into wet light, and Kesk Reach and its skiffs and its lies folded up and vanished behind them into the fold of transit. Then it was quiet, and it was dark, and they were both alive, and the Marigold was bleeding. They limped out of jump 6 hours later at the edge of a dead system, a place with a burnt-out cinder of a star and nothing worth naming, which was precisely why Daniel chose it. He put the ship in the shadow of a lightless gas giant, cut every emission he could, and let her drift, dark and cold and hard to find. It was, he reflected, the same trick Luna had used on him, hide the important thing inside the least important place. And he told her so, and she almost smiled. They spent a day patching what could be patched. The stern was a mess of scorched plating and severed conduit, and the fuel loss was permanent short of a shipyard. But Daniel had spent his whole life keeping this ship alive on spit and stubbornness, and Luna, it developed, had hands that were quick and clever and unafraid of the ugly work. They worked in the cramped engineering crawl space shoulder to shoulder, passing tools, and somewhere in the passing of tools the wariness between them had quietly gone. He'd stopped watching the fangs. She'd stopped watching the door. It had happened without either of them deciding it, the way the tea had happened, the way most of the true things in a life arrive without a vote. It was in the crawl space, elbow deep in the conduit, that she finally told him what she'd seen. Kasser wasn't just an elder of the night clans. He was in the middle of a long, patient project, a treaty negotiated in secret with a consortium of inner-world shipping magnates to sell the clan's oldest and most closely held asset, the Sanguine biotech that made the night clans what they were, the cellular architecture behind their strength, their long lives, their ability to heal, weaponized, refined, licensed to the highest bidder. It would make Kasser unimaginably rich and hand a handful of already monstrous corporations something that should never have had a price. And Luna, an archivist of the clan's oldest records, had seen the ledgers. She'd seen the names. She'd copied the proof, and she'd run. And it was all still in her, encoded, she explained, into a data thread woven through her own biotech, a place Kasser couldn't simply reach in and delete without killing her, which was the only reason she was still breathing. He needed her intact and returned so it could be extracted quietly. She was evidence with a pulse. "So we can't run forever," Daniel said, sitting back on his heels, wiping conduit grease across his forehead. "Because he can't ever stop, not while you're loose with the receipts." "No." She looked at him steadily in the dim work-light. "And I won't ask you to keep running with me. You've done more than a nobody's freighter owed anyone. You can drop me at a neutral port and disappear back into being unimportant, and I'll—" "Luna." He said it quietly, and she stopped. "You picked my ship because nobody looks at it, because it's beneath notice, because a man like Kasser would never in 1,000 years imagine that anything that mattered could be hiding inside something that small and broken beneath him." Daniel felt the shape of it arriving, the way a plan sometimes does, all at once, absurd and perfect. "That's not a weakness. That's the whole game. He looks straight past nobodies. So let's give him a nobody to look past, right up until it's too late." He laid it out in the crawl space over cooling tea. They wouldn't hide the proof. They'd deliver it, not to any court Kasser had bought, but to the one body that could burn his treaty to the ground, the Inner Compact's Trade Tribunal, which took a dim and lucrative view of anyone monopolizing biotech it hadn't licensed itself. But the tribunal wouldn't meet a fugitive vampire. Kasser's people would intercept her long before she reached the floor. So she wouldn't go. A nobody would. A forgettable freighter pilot with a trustworthy face carrying a shipment nobody would search, would walk the proof right through the front door while Kasser's whole apparatus watched the skies for a fleeing Sanguine that never came. You'd be walking into a tribunal station crawling with his agents, Luna said. If they realize what you're carrying, you don't leave. They won't, that's the point. Nobody frisks the furniture. He grinned. I've been overlooked my entire life, Luna. 2 fiancés, 1 savings account, a customs drone. It's finally going to be useful. They set it in motion. She encoded a copy of the proof into a data slug and buried it in a crate of genuinely worthless freighter parts, coolant couplings, the very thing his wrench was good for. They plotted a course to Taro Hub, the tribunal's seat. And they baited it, a false transponder ghost, launched on a decoy drone, screaming Luna's clan signature out toward the opposite end of the sector to pull the hunt away. It worked beautifully. It worked, in fact, right up until Daniel walked the crate through Taro's cargo checkpoint, trustworthy face and all, and the customs officer scanning it looked up with eyes that were, unmistakably, crimson, and smiled at him with delicate, familiar fangs. A nobody's freighter, the officer said pleasantly, gesturing to 2 others already closing in behind Daniel. Kasser did wonder if she'd think of that. He thinks of everything, you see. It's what makes him tiresome. Now, where is she? And don't insult us both by reaching for that wrench. Daniel did not reach for the wrench. This surprised everyone, including Daniel, who had assumed right up to that moment that reaching for the wrench was the only genuine reflex he possessed. Instead, he did the single thing his entire unremarkable life had trained him for, the thing he was, when it came down to it, a true and undisputed master of. He looked confused and slightly pathetic. "Where is who?" he said. And the beauty of it was that 70% of the fear in his voice was real, which sold the other 30. "Look, officer, I'm a freighter pilot. I haul couplings. That's the job. That's the whole job. If this is about the docking incident at Kesk Reach, I already filed a complaint. They clamped me. Enough." The crimson-eyed officer stepped closer, and the 2 others fanned out with the unhurried confidence of people who had never once in their long lives been in a hurry. "You delivered this crate. She's threaded the proof into cargo before. We'll take it apart molecule by molecule, and we'll take you apart the same way if she isn't aboard your little wreck. So," a cold smile, "save yourself the afternoon." And here was the thing Kasser's people, for all their patience and all their centuries, had failed to account for, because it had never once occurred to any of them to imagine it. They'd found the decoy. They'd found it because Daniel had let them find it. The crate of couplings held a data slug, yes, a real one, encoded exactly as promised. And it was, from top to bottom, a fabrication. Names that didn't exist. Ledgers that led nowhere. Bait so convincing precisely because it was built to be caught, so that the moment they seized it, they'd stop looking, satisfied, and file their report to Kasser that the loose thread was in hand. The real proof had walked onto Taro Hub 6 hours earlier, in the arms of a woman with her long ears tucked under a maintenance hood and a synth bank ID that read as staff, who had spent those 6 hours quietly finding her way to the one place on the station Kasser's money couldn't follow, the sealed chamber of the trade tribunal itself, where the treaty he'd spent decades building was, at that exact moment, being read aloud into the record by a very unhappy panel of compact adjudicators who did not take kindly to unlicensed biotech monopolies operating under their noses. Luna hadn't needed Daniel to smuggle the proof in. Daniel was the smuggle. He was the loud, obvious, catchable nobody, drawing every crimson eye in the station to a crate of worthless parts, while the actual thread of the whole tapestry walked in through a door nobody was watching. He'd been overlooked his entire life. He had finally, gloriously, weaponized it. "You know," Daniel said, and he let the confusion drop off his face like a coat, because the timing felt right and a man deserves one good moment. "The trouble with thinking of everything is that you stop checking the small stuff. You looked for a fleeing vampire. You looked for hidden data. You never once looked at me, really looked, because a nobody isn't worth the glance." He tilted his head. She learned that trick from watching Kasser. Then she used it on him. The officer's face changed. The pleasant certainty curdled into something Daniel found deeply, personally satisfying, and the crimson eyes flicked to a comm unit, and the officer said one urgent word into it, and got nothing back but the flat tone of a channel that no longer connected to anything, because by then the tribunal chamber was sealed, and the reading was done, and the treaty was already, formally and irrevocably, dead. Kasser did not come with fire in the end. Men like Kasser never do when it comes to it. The fire is for villagers and for people who can't afford lawyers. He came, 3 days later, as a strained and courteous message routed through 6 intermediaries, offering Luna her freedom and her silence, and a truly obscene sum of money to make it all quietly go away. But there was nothing left to buy. The compact had the proof. The treaty was struck from the record, and the magnates who'd signed it were watching their own stock burn, and Kasser, stripped of his great expensive project, was no longer an elder to be feared, but simply a very old man who'd gambled centuries of standing on a secret, and lost it to an archivist and a freighter pilot with a bad thruster. His own clan, it turned out, had opinions about being sold. He spent the rest of his considerable life answering to them. It was, Luna said, a far worse fate than fire. They met back at the Marigold 2 days after that, in a legitimate dock at Taro Hub, in daylight, without anyone chasing anyone. Daniel had spent the interval getting the stern welded by an actual shipyard for the first time in the ship's life, and she gleamed in a way that embarrassed him slightly, like a dog groomed against its will. "So," Luna said, standing at the foot of the ramp, hood down, ears in the open air, no longer hunted, no longer hiding, and visibly unsure what a person does with the sudden absence of both. "You're not a nobody anymore. The tribunal knows your name. 2 ex-fiancés are about to feel very foolish. Give it a week. The galaxy has a short memory and I have a forgettable face. I'll be furniture again by month's end." He looked at her, and the babble that used to fill these silences was gone. He found he didn't need it. "The berth's free, though. If you wanted somewhere no one looks. Turns out it's the safest thing I own." Luna considered the ship that had insulted her by being unremarkable, and the man who had turned out to be the least unremarkable thing in the sky. Then she walked up the ramp, past him, into the amber warmth of the cabin, and picked up his ugly gray blanket with the scorch mark shaped like Australia, and settled into the co-pilot seat, as though she'd always meant to. "Lean left, you said." She glanced back at him, crimson eyes bright, fangs showing in something that was, unmistakably, a grin. "Show me the rest of the ways she's broken. I want to learn all of them." Daniel climbed into the pilot's berth, woke the Marigold with a touch, and felt her hum up around the 2 of them, exactly as beneath notice, and exactly as full of hidden things as she had always been. He'd spent 3 weeks and half a lifetime chasing the only thing that had never left him. It turned out he'd been building room for one more. He leaned left and they flew. Somewhere out there, a beat-up freighter is still flying, leaning left, held together by tape and stubbornness, carrying 2 people the galaxy never thought to look at twice, and maybe that's the part worth keeping. Because Daniel spent his whole life being overlooked, and he came to believe that being unimportant was the same as being worthless. 2 people had left him. A savings account had emptied. The world had passed its quiet verdict, forgettable, and he'd agreed with it, right up until the day it saved his life, and hers. So ask yourself, how many times have you been overlooked and mistaken it for being unwanted? How many of the things you were quietly ashamed of, too small, too broke, too ordinary, too easy to walk past, were never flaws at all, but simply strengths that hadn't found their moment yet? Luna searched the whole galaxy for a safe place to hide. She thought she'd chosen the Marigold because it was beneath notice. But maybe the truest shelters in our lives are exactly that, the unremarkable ones. The person no one else values. The quiet corner the world ignores. The nobody who turns out to be the only one who never leaves. We spend so long chasing what glitters, and we walk straight past the plain, patient thing that would have held us all along. So here is the question the Marigold leaves drifting in her wake. What in your life have you dismissed as too ordinary to matter? And what would happen if you finally looked again? The end. Luna and Daniel's story is over, friends. I hope you enjoyed it. Please hit the like button, leave your thoughts about the story in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next story. See you in the next one.